This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Immigration and efforts to reform the system have been perennial issues in the United States since its founding. But have you ever wondered what it's really like to be an immigrant in this country? Reading Roya Hakakian's latest book, A Beginner's Guide to America, I thought back to the stories my parents told me when they immigrated from India to Northwest Pennsylvania in the late 1970s. How much did they keep from me? And if I had known everything, how would it have changed how I viewed my parents' story in this country? Roya Hakakian came to the U.S. as a refugee from Iran with her family in the 1980s. She's an author and poet who now lives in Connecticut, and she joins me for the hour. Roya, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucy. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Again, your latest book is A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. You've written several books, including Journey from the Land of No. You're a poet, publishing at least 2 collections of poetry in Persian. Tell us a little bit about your story. As a child growing up in Iran, what was it like before the 1979 revolution?
You know, I keep saying that it's probably nostalgia that makes my childhood seem even more idyllic than probably it was. But what I remember is a religiously eclectic neighborhood where we had on a small block people and neighbors from all sorts of religious backgrounds. And it was really a magical thing where I knew that, you know, the people who were on my right in the house beside us were Christian Armenians, and the people across the streets were Zoroastrian Iranians, and the people to my left were Baha'i Iranians, and then my best friend on the street, about whom I write a great deal in my memoir, Journey from the Land of No, was a Shiite Muslim girl in a big family of 7 children. And, you know, we all got along and life was quite peaceful until the 1979 revolution came in February, and things were never the same.
Your family is Persian Jewish, so talk about the community in Iran. Many Americans who may not know a lot about Iran, it probably surprises them to hear you talk about how eclectic your old neighborhood was.
Exactly. And a lot of people who hear that I was born and raised Jewish in Iran are surprised to hear that there were Jews in Iran at all, whereas there were Jews in Iran, or I should say the history of Jewish presence in Iran precedes the history of Muslim presence in Iran. And Jews are so much more indigenous to Iran than anybody knows. You know, we had a community of about 100,000 plus Jews prior to 1979 in Iran. And I attended a Hebrew day school until I was in 7th or 8th grade, which is when the revolution happened. And, you know, we practiced, there were synagogues, and unlike the memories that my parents had about growing up Jewish in Iran in their youth, where my father especially had been born and raised in a small village called Khonsar, and he had been subject 80, 90 years ago to a lot of anti-Semitism. I, born and raised in Tehran, really didn't experience what he had experienced. I felt myself just another kid on the block, and didn't really feel anything overtly or even not overtly that was exercised against me or toward me because of my religion, which is a great statement about how far Iran had come from the decades past where my father had been born to my time, and how much more we had become an egalitarian society in a matter of 3 or 4 decades.
And then the Islamic Revolution happened. And how did that impact your family, Roya?
Well, the Islamic Revolution happened, and one of the things that really shook the Jewish community in Iran was the execution of a Jewish industrialist and a philanthropist who had been one of the most important figures within the business community. He had brought plastic to Iran, and his name was Habib El Ghanian, and he had established factories that produced plastic products. So he was a major employer, but he was also a major figure in the modernization of Iran in the 20th century. What was very shocking was that El Ghanian, who had been a beloved figure both within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community, was among the first leaders to be arrested and then summarily, very quickly executed. And that fact threw shockwaves in the Jewish community because it was interpreted as a sign of worse things to come and other executions to follow. There were not further executions that came, or at least not immediately, but nonetheless, the execution of El Ghanian about 8 weeks after the success of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 caused the Iranian Jewish community to really uproot itself. And then, the laws changed. And one of the things I always feel compelled to say was that the laws after the revolution were designed in such a way that they gave privilege to practicing Shiite Muslims. And that's a very important distinction because it wasn't so that laws were written to eliminate Jews from society, or there were anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic laws that were written. Rather, they were laws that were written to give an advantage to those Muslims who were practicing and were Shiite. And I say that because there are also Sunni Muslims in Iran, and they were at a disadvantage too. And there were, Christians and Baha'is and Zoroastrians and all sorts of other religious groups who were somewhat relegated to second-class citizenship because in comparison or in various competitions, they could not do as well as Shiite Muslims would do. And a prime example of that is, universities had a major entrance exam, and a moral component was added to these university exams. And so it wasn't enough that you scored high on the subjects of science and math or whatever else, but you also had to prove yourself morally, and you could prove yourself morally, of course, if you were a practicing Shiite person for whom the local mosque could vouch. And that's how slowly others who were not, who didn't belong to this community, began to lose their momentum and their advantage in the Iranian society.
I understand during this time after the Ayatollah came to power, your brothers had already been in the U.S. As students. So what was the turning point when your family decided it was time to leave?
Well, in 1980, Iraq attacked Iran, and a full-blown war followed. And there were moments throughout that war which lasted nearly 10 years, and it's one of the longest, most devastating wars of the last century. There were moments that the war could have come to a peaceful end, or there could have been negotiations, but the Iranian leadership somewhat embraced this attack because it allowed them to exercise other ideological agendas that they had, including the major agenda of freeing Israel, or returning Israel to the Palestinians. So the big slogan in those days was we welcome this attack because it will give us or speed up the opportunity for us to go through Baghdad and then reach Jerusalem, which meant that they were not only going to defeat the Iraqi attack, but also move on further to, so-called liberate Palestine. And so once the war just seemed to become never ending, it was very clear to my family that my brothers couldn't return because they would be conscripted in the war and they would have to serve. And it wasn't something that any of us wanted them to do. So it left us with no choice other than leaving Iran.
That must have been difficult for you as a child who, as you described, had a wonderful upbringing. What do you remember about that time when your parents told you, or I know you came here with your mother, that it was time to leave your homeland?
I didn't want to leave. I was a teenager. I had just begun writing in Persian. And even though I was 15, 16, people were taking me seriously. And, I guess there's nothing more joyous to be an aspiring poet or writer and have grown-ups who know literature tell you that you're a talent. And so that really moved me. And it was, it also made me realize that I had something that I wanted to do, that I had a direction. And while I was kind of developing as a writer, suddenly my parents told me that we were going to leave, and it was unimaginable for me to leave the land of that literature and that language that I had just begun to find a footing in. So I was against it. I fought tooth and nail to stay for as long as I could. And I think I managed to delay my parents until I got my high school diploma.
Again, you're hearing Roya Hakakian here on Where We Live. She's an author and poet. She lives in Connecticut. Her latest book is A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. You talk about this place that poetry had in your life, but your father was also a poet. Can you give us more of a glimpse of how poetry is such a central part of Persian culture?
It was certainly in my childhood, and I think it was, for lack of a better comparison or metaphor, it was the equivalent of, baseball for an American. It's what we did. It was not simply a form of art or an expression of literature. It was also a national hobby and a pastime, and a way that the best way, the most significant way in which the Iranian self expressed itself. And what was very entertaining for me when I was just beginning to write at the cusp of sort of adolescence was that my father had caught me writing and reading a lot of poetry, and I was reading modern poetry of a new generation that my father and his generation didn't really take seriously. So he started making fun with me of the things I was reading. So we used to banter. He used to write classical poetry that was rhymed and, musically sound, to say that the poetry I was reading wasn't good enough. And I would, in return, write in modern unrhymed poetry that his classical poetry was only concerned with music and not content. And I didn't take that seriously. So we would go back and forth in writing. But all along, we were composing poems, even though in two separate traditions. And this is one of the highlights of my adolescence.
That must have been a really lovely experience. And when you look back at your poetry as a teenager, what do you think today, Roya?
Well, it was very, very bad. And I'm glad that a lot of it is lost because, so little survives, crossing the continents. But it was a great time because I think it allowed my father and me to develop a different relationship that wasn't just the father-daughter relationship. It was also an exchange between two generations that viewed poetry in entirely different ways. But he did it so lovingly and so wittily. And, I was going through his notes since he had passed away, and I was trying to put together a collection of his poems. And I came across some of them, and it brought back so many memories of those years.
You dedicated your latest book to your father. You write, "In memory of my father, the first Hakakian to write, the last Hakakian to arrive in America." I want to hear more about your arrival story and about your latest book. Roya Hakakian, my guest today here on Where We Live. You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. What is it really like to come to this country as a new immigrant? Author Roya Hakakian's new book, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious, provides an overview of the immigrant experience, from what it's like to first arrive and learning a new culture. There's humor in the guidebook, too. What is it really like finding love in this new land? Roya writes, "You might say it took God half as many steps to create the universe, and ask why American courtship is so prolonged." Roya joins me here on Where We Live on Zoom. She lives in Connecticut. Roya, you were talking about you not wanting to leave Iran, but eventually you came to the U.S. with your mother as refugees. Where did you end up?
We first arrived in New York, and one of the little stories in the book, in one of the tables about, Helen and her daughter Roya, is a story of the two of us in New York City, and a day that, it was a few weeks after we had arrived. I had just begun going to English as a second language classes, and my mother didn't speak any English. And we used to go to places together. One day I had a job interview in the city and had to leave my mother on the train. So I was very worried that she might not find her way home from the subway station. So I walked with her into the subway. I put her on the subway and I told her where to get off. And then the subway doors closed. And as soon as the doors closed and the train was taking off, over the intercom system, there was an announcement saying that the N subway that I had put my mother on was going to run on the R line,
Oh, no.
which meant that my mother was on the wrong subway. And just, I was terrified. And, the thought that after having brought her down, into the station and walking her on the platform and telling her what to do, I had exactly put her on the wrong train, really made me, incredibly worried. So I returned home. And as the story in the book goes, at the end of the day, the conductor, who was an African-American woman who had realized my mother didn't speak English and needed to be brought home, had brought her home at the end of her shift, which was one of the most moving early experiences of our immigration.
I mentioned my parents immigrated to this country, and I feel like we all have those stories of moments when American generosity has helped our parents or our grandparents. And you talk about that, not just the faults we find in America, whether we're native born or have come to this country, but just the fact that Americans are so generous, and this feeling of service that can be strange to other people coming from different parts of the world.
Exactly. One of the things I tried to do in the book is kind of explain the thing that took me a while, and perhaps it took your parents a while to understand, which is that the generosity we knew or exercised in our home countries isn't the same brand of generosity. For instance, it was very easy for us and continues to be to have people over for meals. It wasn't even a formal, it didn't even require a formal invitation. If somebody was over, we would say, stay for dinner, or it just didn't take all the ceremony it takes oftentimes in America to have people over for a meal. It was very easy, and it may not have been, there may not have been enough, but we somehow had people come over all the time and join in a meal. And it's not so here. People are more formal. They send out invitations, and you go to their home, and they have sometimes placement cards around a table to tell you where to sit. And there's just a lot more that goes into having a meal in an American home. But on the other hand, Americans, or I should say native-born Americans, because I'm a naturalized American too, native-born Americans exercise generosity in ways that I didn't know, and we didn't exercise back home in Iran. For instance, these foundations didn't exist where I come from. The notion that you could apply as an artist or a writer or a scientist to anything but a government body and receive funding to do something, to continue your work, was unthinkable. There were also other things, the idea of going to hospitals and holding someone's hand just because they were lonely. These things may have been informal exercises, but in America, they have become part of a national practice. And I think it took a while for me, as it did for my family, to recognize that while we are surprised by certain practices that don't exist here, we're just equally surprised by certain practices that we never knew and have come to embrace. And I think that took a lot of learning.
Again, you don't write this book as a memoir, but more as a guide for the newly arrived immigrant. But are you really writing this for native-born Americans to get a glimpse of all of the things that immigrants experience and have to learn in this new life?
I thought in 2016, when the anti-immigrant rhetoric was reaching a fever pitch, and I was hearing certain statements, including the idea that immigrants who come here commit crimes, that I found incredibly not just offensive, but downright false. And I thought, what could I do to add something to this conversation? What could I do, given who I was, given that I had come here as a refugee and I had been an immigrant, and knowing everything that I know? Was there any way that I could inform this conversation so that people would know differently or feel differently? And so I had to think long and hard about what it was that would enable me to get people to listen. And I realized that, or at least I should say that I came down on the side of the voice of a guidebook, because I thought, people have written memoirs as immigrants, and we read a lot of third-person accounts by reporters or policymakers about the immigrant experience. And what if I don't do the first person and I don't do the third person, and instead I stick to the second person voice and try to bring the native-born Americans who have never had to be uprooted or transplanted, who have never had this cataclysmic immigration experience? What if I could bring them very close to the thoughts of an immigrant, the feelings of an immigrant, the early experiences of an immigrant. What if I could make the immigrant truly accessible to the people who have never undergone that experience? Would that be a contribution? And I thought the answer to that question was yes. That if I could make the immigrant more accessible, then as a result, perhaps I could make I could neutralize the negative ideas that were circulating about immigrants. Because, at the end of the day, I think, for me at least, when I first came, without English, without skills, a teenager who was totally disoriented, my greatest effort on a daily basis went into putting one foot in front of the other, finding places, knowing how to get on the subway and get off the subway, or, how to find a job. And these elementary things took everything I had and then some. And to think that immigrants would then come here and on top of everything that they had to do, they were being accused of committing crimes was just, not part of, in any shape or form, what I had known or would be possible in the universe in which I had come into and existed. And so the book is an effort to make that experience, which, so many of us have never had, knowable and accessible to the rest of us.
Roya Hakakian, again, her new book, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. She's on the show today as we talk about this book and her life. It really stood out to me when you spend time giving a glimpse into what it's really like. The stages of arrival, you write, are like stages of grief. Can you flesh that out more for us?
Yes, I think the stages of arrival, exactly as you put it, are similar to the stages of grief, because no matter how difficult the circumstances were that we as immigrants leave behind, I think at the end of the day, none of us want to be separated from the place into which we've been born and in which we've been raised, and where our ancestors have been buried. I think the idea that things can be imperfect in places, and as a result, we may have to be driven out of those places because life becomes untenable, exists. However, it doesn't mean that we do it willingly or that we prefer to leave these places, however imperfect they are. So I think we all arrive, even if we have come willingly, with a certain degree of grief. And so we go through these early days, weeks, and months of arrival in the same way that we experience the loss of something important or an important person. So I remember, in those early weeks, oftentimes people would ask me where I was from. I would tell them I was from Iran, and they would say, then you must be delighted to be here. And, eventually I am delighted that I'm here, but I wasn't delighted that I was in America in those early weeks. And that truly just, salted my wound, because the thought that people thought that it was an easy thing to be here, or that I had chosen to uproot myself, or however many gifts this country had, or I was benefiting from, would neutralize or allay the pain of the loss that I had experienced, was unthinkable to me. And so I think it takes a while, and it takes weeks and months of going through what I describe in the book and hear from other fellow immigrants, is simply like months of walking through fog, which is sort of a physical jet lag, but also an emotional jet lag, until we emerge from the fog and begin to kind of piece a new life back together.
Earlier, you talked about a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric over the last several years, and trying to think about a way to write this book that could help native-born Americans and others understand what it's really like. I wanted to ask you your reaction to something that happened this week. A Georgia man arrested for the shooting deaths of 8 people, 6 of them women who are of Asian descent.
Mm-hmm.
This is a story that is still unfolding, but when you hear these things happen as someone whose parents are immigrants, and when you think about all the times that in the last decade even where certain communities are targeted because of the race, when these situations happen, what runs through your mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that they are undoing the promise and the premise of America, that the only advantage or the most important quality that has made America what it is the idea that it became a destination for all the people who, for one reason or another, had chosen to come here, even if unwillingly, but had made this country their destination, or, as I say, in the last chapter of the book, it's somewhat of a promised land, because they could not go on in places where they had been born. And so this is precisely sort of the American formula. It is what has made this country a leading, innovative figure or force in the world, because we have brought all the nationalities or ethnicities and races from across the world who thought that being in America would give them the opportunities that they didn't have in their homelands. So I think the first and foremost thing that everyone should recognize, and I hope they do, is that every one of these acts is not an act simply against a single group of Asians or African Americans or whomever, but it's an act against the American formula. It's an act against the promise that has made America what it is. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. The second thing, perhaps, which is equally important to remember, is that America has gone through these periods of discrimination and violent reaction to various racial groups. And while we must do everything we can to prevent them from occurring, we must also remember that we have, despite the tragedies, managed to incorporate these communities within a generation or two into the fabric of our societies. So our movement as a nation has been a movement toward improvement, and I think we need to keep that up.
You mentioned generations. Isn't it interesting when a family has been here for several generations, and how that feeling of being anti-immigrant starts to bubble up again? It's as if we forget what our relatives have experienced. What is that about this country that occurs, Roya?
It's very interesting, because I find this within the Iranian American community too, that it's as if we come in, and as soon as we get in, we want to shut the door on people behind us. I am not sure I entirely understand it, but I think it is a negative manifestation of us or our desire to belong. And we think that belonging means creating an exclusive club. and therefore excluding other people, because if we're going to belong, we should be the only ones here. However, the truth is that we continue to exercise this strange ritual, which is almost like a hazing ritual, which we inflict discrimination, or we inflict damage, harm onto new immigrant communities when they begin to arrive, and then a generation or two later, we begin to regret it, and the next generations begin to express remorse and do the opposite. Celebrate those communities that came, and I think it's important to keep telling ourselves that if we have become the nation that we have become, if we have contributed to global innovation and leadership in whatever way, it has in fact been in a great part because of this human salad, medley of racial and ethnic communities of people to come here and thrive. And the moment we cease to do that is the moment that we cease to be the America that has had an edge.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Roya Hakakian, an author and poet. She lives in Connecticut. Her latest book, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. If you go to our website, wnpr.org/where we live, you can read an excerpt of this book. We'll continue our conversation right after a quick break. You're listening to Where We Live. My guest today on Zoom, Roya Hakakian, an author and poet. Her latest book, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. It's not all serious, Roya. Definitely humor throughout, including America's obsession with the weather and our pets. But I wondered if you could read an excerpt from your book for us.
Sure. This is a passage from a chapter called The Diaspora. And here's how it goes. In lieu of haggling, once the most satisfying aspect of any shopping experience for your fellow expatriates, they have embraced the exercise of returning, which might well be haggling's fair-haired twin. On weekends, they load their spacious trunks with the purchased goods they plan to return, something that was unthinkable where they came from. At first, they even return the things they need, just to see if they can. When this belief gives way to faith in the sanctity of the return policy, they begin to return only what truly needs returning. They had expected to see the suspension bridges, the underwater tunnels, the endless forests and bottomless seas. But it is the exercise of returning goods that is the surest sign of America's greatness to them. The experience of an underwater tunnel lasts only a few minutes. However, the experience of a trial sweatshirt whose price tag scratches against the nape lasts for days. It is why they cherish their receipts and keep them alongside other well-guarded family treasures. Returning items is the proof that the consumer, one of the several manifestations of the citizen, is formidable here. It is the evidence that anything is possible because a one-time decision need not be destiny. You can change your fate here and turn it in for a better one. Taking the oath of allegiance is a rote promise. To stand head high at a customer service counter, receipt in hand, turning in an unwanted garment is an actual step toward claiming one's rights, acting as an entitled citizen would. Even after all these years, each time a reluctant shopkeeper takes an item back, you stagger out in awe, praising God and his most unsung messenger, George Washington. This is one of the many small joys of living in America that only you, privileged with a keen knowledge of despotism, deeply cherish.
I love that when I read it, Roya. Throughout the book, you also talk about democracy, but in a different way than how we may think of it, such as our voting rights. You see American democracy really in every part of our life, including the observations that you make of people. They're just hanging out at a public park. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think it and it's one of the things that I have come to in the past few years, especially since 2016, that part of the reason it's become questionable whether we need to fight for this democracy, I think, is because we can see its daily small manifestations in our lives and in how, on a routine basis, we benefit from its gifts. And I think, one of the things I tried to do in the book is to try to make these small manifestations that may be invisible to those who have never lived in an undemocratic society visible. So, in this passage, I refer to, returning items because it was unthinkable where I came from that we returned something to the store, nobody took anything back. Another manifestation is, this simple idea that we can wear whatever we want and go to the park and chill on the lawn and just lay down on the grass and play whatever music we want in the headphones and be was also unthinkable where I come from, in Iran. Women were subject to mandatory dress code. We couldn't decide what it was that we wanted to put on. If we had to put on what the laws and government told us we had to. So these small joys need to be seen if we're going to nurture and cultivate and propagate this democracy, because if we don't, it may seem like just a routine every 4 years an election ordeal that will then become easier to lose.
You mentioned earlier that you are now an American citizen. What was that naturalization process like for you? You poke fun at even the term being naturalized in the book.
I delayed it for many, many years. I could have become naturalized 5 years after I had received my green card, but I didn't do it until after 10, perhaps 12 years. It took me a long time, and in part because I just couldn't reconcile with the idea of, giving up something else that I had been for so long and then switching. It seemed exactly unnatural to naturalize, because how could we truly surrender 18 years of our lives? So I had to kind of piece it together in a way that would be morally acceptable to myself. And finally, after 10 or 12 years, I remember going to the courthouse in New Haven with a friend who was very excited to watch me. And I remember thinking that the only reason I could do it was because to become an American would allow and even embrace the notion of me as the person from all these other places or all these other components that I was. And it was with that in mind that I was able to become naturalized, only when I realized that I didn't have to surrender those other pieces, but that becoming an American allowed me to weave those into who I was becoming now.
We live in an interesting time when we think about the conversations around racial justice. Roya, in your book, you write about how immigrants should view this history and their expectations of being seen as equals in America. What is your message to immigrants listening today?
Well, for one thing, I certainly, when first came to this country, didn't think that any of the history of racial injustices had anything to do with me. Because, I had been a refugee. I had come from somewhere else. I had never been part of what had happened here. But in truth, after 10, 20 years, when I become a naturalized citizen and I see that, I'm having an easier time living here as an immigrant and being accepted by the broader American community as an immigrant and as someone from, elsewhere, then I have to think about how this happened. And it is only lately that I have, in the past few years, that I have begun to see that the reason we as immigrants are more accepted and find it easier to be, to thrive here is because there has been this long-standing history of racial struggle for equality. And I have begun to recognize that if the African American community had not done all that it has done in order to reach or make the American society a more equal society, I would have never been the immigrant that I am today. That I owe them this acceptance and the space that they have created for people who are not of the same complexion or the same origin to be brought in to this country and accepted far more than, say, in other Western societies. So finally, after all these years, I'm beginning to see that even though I had no part in the racial history of this country, but I have become an unwitting beneficiary of the struggle that it has taken to make America more equal.
I wanted to end on this quote from your book, A Beginner's Guide to America, related to what we just talked about. You must do all you can to tell the story of the slaves and their indispensable legacy to your children, because if their story fades, the story of immigrants will fade too. Then before you know it, you will no longer be welcome. Roya Hakakian, it was a pleasure to speak with you this hour about your new book. I hope to invite you back sometime.
Thank you, Lucy. I truly enjoyed it.
Today's show was produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer this week is Eugene Amatruda. Thank you, Gene. Our theme music for Where We Live is composed by Hannes Brown. Also, tomorrow is first day of spring. We hope you have a great weekend. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.